Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen, Harsha?
Yes, you can go ahead, sir.
Okay. At the outset, let me wish you all in the different parts of the country happy Makar Sankranti, and it's a very good auspicious harvest day. It basically means that at the end of the harvest season, people are filled with money, and people like us, we should be happy that we're filled with knowledge. Let me also take this opportunity to congratulate Sri Harsha for the interest he's showing and the dedication he's showing. I was very sort of humbled by the way he's taking up things, and he's a role model of how he's teaching people, and he himself is actually showing us the path, how to actually behave yourself, show a path to your colleagues and your junior colleagues. So what we're going to talk today is about how to launch an impactful career in obstructive sleep apnea. This is something that actually struck me when I finished my post-graduation. And at that time, obstructive sleep apnea was not even in the radar in India. I mean, people didn't even know such a thing. Like, of course, people knew that obstructive sleep apnea existed, but people were not, especially ENTs, who immediately finished this postgraduates, did not even have a concept that a career can be built in ENT in obstructive sleep apnea. Not until I went to America that I actually knew that there is a subspecialty of ENT, and you can actually make a career out of it. So before we go ahead with my presentation, I would like to talk about the objectives, what I'm going to talk to you all about today. First, I'll talk to you about the gravity of the disease so that you'll understand what is in store for us as ENT surgeons, and what are the perspectives in terms of an ENT surgeon, a budding ENT surgeon in the field of obstructive sleep apnea. I will also talk about fellowship opportunities, both in India and abroad, and what it takes. I will also talk about the learning curve, not only in terms of skills in managing these things. I'll also talk a few words about decision making, which is the most important thing in the management of obstructive sleep apnea. A few words of scope of practice in India and my journey so far I will share with you. Now, this is something that I always show. This is a video of a patient with obstructive sleep apnea. This is one type of patient. This is one kind of patient. Look at his facial grimace. He is in sleep. He's trying to breathe very hard. But if you really look at his facial grimace, you obviously will not think that he's definitely not enjoying his sleep. If this is one kind of a patient, this is another kind of patient. Of course, he's been given some amount of sedation. This is just before he dies. But very clearly you can see if the earlier patient was obese, this patient is definitely a skeletal patient. And is obviously again struggling very hard to breathe. These are the patients, dear colleagues, that we deal with, struggling to breathe, and we need to do something for them. Giving a CPAP for these patients is definitely not an option, at least for this guy. Unless you make a custom-made face mask, how is this person going to use such a CPAP? Now, if you really look at an article published by the Lancet in the as recent as 2019, this is a fantastic article about the global burden of sleep apnea, and wherein they estimated that 1 billion adults between age 30 to 69 years worldwide could be suffering from obstructive sleep apnea. A billion people. And the cost, and this is in the US, and this was actually calculated in 2015. If you actually bring all the sums, like workplace accidents, motor vehicle accidents because of sleep apnea, comorbid disease billing, loss of productivity, it's about $149.6 billion of loss that is happening in terms of economy because of obstructive sleep apnea. So the disease is out there. The scope is huge. The disease is out there. A lot of them don't even get picked up. And if you look at it from purely a marketing perspective, the largest market is, of course, North America. But what is the fastest growing market? It's South Asia. Because of our skeletons and our kind of a central obesity kind of a phenotype that we have, in 2019, I gave a lecture in the American Academy meeting to actually talk about how Indians are more vulnerable to obstructive sleep apnea with a lower BMI compared to probably all other races. And I'll be very happy to share with you that basic talk, wherein we discussed the genetical differences. We spoke about craniofacially how we are different, and our lifestyles are very different. And even though we are not very fat when compared to our Caucasian people, or our skeletons are not very flat in terms of the facial profile, like a mongoloid profile, even without those two caveats, we are more vulnerable to obstructive sleep apnea. There was a beautiful paper by Professor Punjabi from Johns Hopkins, if I'm not mistaken. The Indian incidence is 7.1 compared to 4.5 in the US and 4.1 in countries like Australia. So the potential is definitely there. What is also happening is, unfortunately, most of our colleagues in the respiratory medicine or pulmonary medicine, or those of them who have done sleep medicine fellowships in the US and have come back, I can talk for my city. Unfortunately, the buck is stopping after giving him the CPAP. Nobody is taking the discussion further in terms of as to whether the person is using it, what is happening to the comorbidities that are associated with obstructive sleep apnea after that prescription is given. Is he actually using them or no? The gold standard treatment of obstructive sleep apnea is PAP therapy. Sorry for not blacking out the eyes, but I just wanted you all to see these marks of these patients here. This is a fresh mark. This is another mark. This is another mark. What do you think all these marks are? These marks are marks caused by necrosis, caused by a very tight-fitting CPAP mask. Because for some reason or the other, there is leak happening, or the patient is not able to get that reduction in AHI because there are some obstructions, static obstructions in the airway that is increasing the CPAP pressure. And because the mask is not that tight fitting, there was leak, and the respiratory technician sees it as a leak and puts the mask even tighter. And all these patients, if you ask them to use another mask, obviously they are not going to use. They come to us and say, "Doc, please do something else. Please do something else and get rid of this for us. We need to also understand that obstructive sleep apnea is a journey, dear friends. At some point, we will need to give them the CPAP. Where we come in is how long can you give them a disease, a CPAP independent life? That is the whole crux of it. And also, giving a CPAP, all of us can do, right? But after giving the CPAP, we also need to it up. We have a lot of patients coming from North America, from Australia, those who have been given CPAPs by very esteemed of our colleagues in North America and Australia and in the UK. They're just given the mask. Nobody is even tracking them, But please remember, CPAP is a fantastic tool. I am not saying that CPAP is a bad tool, but a lot of people don't use it. Now, this is a beautiful paper by Clete Kushida. Clete Kushida is the chairman of the Stanford sleep program, and they have done this fantastic paper, which was published, I think, in 2017, when they did a 6-month randomized, double-blind, 2-arm, sham-controlled, multi-center trial on 1,516 patients. Okay, and all of them have been supposedly been using CPAP. They found, when analyzing CPAP over a previous month, that the compliance rate at 6 months was a mere 39%, sorry, beg your pardon, in the active CPAP group. Now, what does this statement tell you? These patients have been written off saying that, okay, they are active CPAP users, we don't have to worry about it. But how many of them were actually using it? Only 39%. So what is happening to the 60% people? What is happening to all the comorbid diseases that were supposed to be associated because of the sleep apnea not being treated? That's the problem, dear friends. So if you really look at the percentage of non-compliance, if you bring all the data together, it's anywhere between 29% to 83%. That means there are some people who use it very well. There are some people who don't use it very well. And this definition is based on the fact that you are considered to be a successful CPAP user if you use it at least 4 hours per night. If you have a patient and he's saying, I'm using it 4 hours per night, you come into the category of a user, and a category of user who come under the broad heading of a compliant user. Okay, but is 4 hours really enough for these patients to take care of all these comorbid conditions? Is another debate for another time. These are huge issues and debates that we have in our conferences when we talk about compliance of CPAP. Anyway, let me just take this further. But there are patients who actually are like this. Just pay attention to this video. This is a patient in whom we are doing a DICE. This is the base tongue. These are the tonsils. This is the uvula. Okay, and this patient has been given a CPAP, and he's been trying to use it for the past 2 years without any success. And he basically walked into my outpatient clinic, said, doctor, just take this CPAP machine out of me. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not saying that CPAP is a bad tool. All I'm saying is evaluate your patients. These are the tonsils. This is the, let me play this again. Wait. How do I stop notation? Okay, let me see. Okay. These are the tonsils. This is the uvula. And if this patient is given a CPAP, his pressure is going to go very high. Normal pressures at which a person can tolerate CPAP is about 8 to 10 centimeters of water pressure. If you give him a CPAP pressure of about 15, that is the pressure at which this patient was given a CPAP mask, it's like putting your face in front of one of these function hall Almanor fans. You can't bear the pressure. What I was saying earlier was the fact that I'm not saying that CPAP is a bad tool. All I'm saying is, if you want to give the CPAP to a patient, make him use it. It's great. But before you dispense a CPAP to your patient, own up the treatment, examine the patient, find out whether this patient will be able to use it. Is he happy to use it? Only then give the treatment. Now, here are other examples of this. Is something that we see in adults, and most of you do see that nowadays. Here is a patient who has been given a CPAP, and here is another patient, who an 18-year-old, who's been snoring away to glory just because of this lesion, and nobody actually bothered. And this is actually our own colleagues given a CPAP for this patient. The complaint was the patient was snoring. A sleep study was done, which obviously showed some kind of a very high apnea-hypopnea index, and a CPAP was suggested. Nobody, even the only bad point about this patient was, even though the patient was a woman of about 22 or 23 years old, she was slightly on the obese side. So everybody wrote it off, saying that it is something related to obesity. But please remember, dear friends, women have a very low incidence of obstructive sleep apnea. All I'm saying by showing you guys these videos is, before you dispense any kind of a CPAP or you want to dispense any kind of treatment to these patients, scope them. This is another example of a patient having severe dynamic obstructions. But if you give these patients CPAP, obviously they won't be compliant. And you cannot blame your pulmonary colleague to not see these images. They are not in a position to see these images, because how can they are not trained to do these kind of examinations? All they are trained to is do a fantastic job in understanding a sleep study, which all of us as ENT surgeons are also poised to read. And in the next few slides, I will sort of show you ways and means to do it. And if you go by these rules, and these are results of my patients, an apnea-hypopnea index of 77 to an apnea-hypopnea index of 13. Okay, and these apneas, if you look at this study, apneas 534 to 4. Okay, these are gratifying patients. Okay, fantastic results. These patients come back to you and they're pretty happy about it. This is my own patient post-op. This is another patient, an apnea-hypopnea index of 101 to 20. But again, look at the obstructive apneas. Earlier, before surgery, 101 to obstructive apneas 1. The apnea-hypopnea index went up because of the hypopneas. These are gratifying results, dear colleagues. But I don't want to sit in this platform and say you always get everything right. All of us we show only our success, right? We show our fearsome faces and our gorilla movements. But of course, all of us have our own failures and we keep learning. But as you keep learning and growing in the learning curve, you get these kind of reports, very happy, very fulfilling kind of reports. And these are patients who come back to you with their hypertension going down. There is no use to use antihypertensive anymore. Their diabetes is under control. These patients are off antiplatelet medication. this gives you as much satisfaction. The whole family is so happy. The wife is happy, the kids are happy, and you have a very happy patient. And you actually form a bond with these people because you are interfering in terms of their diet, you're interfering everything. Once you've made a patient, is a patient with you for life. So let me talk to you about how you go about learning this subspecialty of ENT. I'll just share with you my mentor, my guru, Professor Tucker Woodson. He's a giant in the field of obstructive sleep apnea. I have mentored under him. This is Professor Claudio Vicini from Europe. Both of them are giants in the field of obstructive sleep apnea. So if you want to train in India, our association, which is the Indian Association of Surgeons for Sleep Apnea, runs a certified training program. We have done a successful program last year. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we had to stop the program. This is the link that I have given you. You can take pictures of it, but you can just go to our website and it says CTP, which is a certified training program, as we call it. It is not a fellowship program because there are certain prerequisites that we need to fulfill in India if you have to call it a fellowship. So we'll have to first run a few certified training programs initially, and then we can have fellowship programs later. There are about 7 or 8 centers which are recognized by our association. It's a 2-month program wherein you get an opportunity to shadow us, and in some centers do hands-on surgery as well. And at the end of the program, you have an opportunity to use all the data that we have and even publish. So at the end of the program, you will also get a certificate, and also you get an opportunity to present in our national and international conferences and meetings that we conduct. So this is a perfectly running program in India. The best part is it's just for 2 months. And the accommodation and the training schedule is different between different centers. So you will have to put in a caution deposit to the society. And the best part is the certified training program is certified by the World Sleep Society, which is a global body. So you would get World Sleep Society certified certificate. I was also talking to you about polysomnography. This is something that all of us, whoever wants to master the science of obstructive sleep apnea, has to master polysomnography. This is something that we need to learn. All people who wants to pursue the field of obstructive sleep apnea should master polysomnography. That means you should have the ability to read your own sleep studies. So there are lots of courses that keep happening. This is the new one that is done by a very good friend of ours, Tripadeep Singh. He's an Indian guy who's based out of Singapore. This is something that you can use. It's a fantastic program. At the end of the program, you will get a certified certificate as well. And you will all be very capable of reading your own and mastering polysomnography. So this is something that you can do. You can save the dates. This is on the 16th to 18th of February. This is you can use this opportunity. What about fellowships abroad? For the US, you definitely have to clear the USMLE. The scores of the USMLE depend on the mentors of the respective fellowship programs, depending upon which university and which program that you apply to. Most of us in the associations, we have very good. See, the best part about this field is there are very few of us in the world. Okay, and we are a very closely knit family in the ENT fraternity of obstructive sleep apnea. So, you have very good friends. So we can always write to them. And if you want to pursue it, you will have to pursue it. But if you want to do it in the US, you will have to get a USMLE. Try to get a decent score at least, and you will be matched to the program. Italy, you can do a shadowing program in Forlì, which is in Italy. You can also do an observership. In Singapore, there are certain doctors who would give you a fellowship if you are willing to pay. Sorry. That's why I said SGD, that is Singapore dollars. If you're willing to pay, there are people who would give you fellowship. At this point, these are private players. They are not in Singapore General Hospital, but you will get fellowship if you are willing to pay some amount of money. Australia, they do an online interview. Australia is again huge. There are a couple of good friends in the university, very close to Sydney, and also in Adelaide. They have fellowship programs, but it is an online interview. The interview is not easy, but those of you who have cleared MRCS definitely have an edge. So if you want to go to Australia, if you have an MRCS, you have a very good chance. Observerships you can get all over the world. You can approach any of our members in the IASSA. We have contacts, like I said, we have a very closely knit group, and most of us can write to them, or and they will be happy to offer you observerships, which I think are pretty good, because operating in the mouth is not a difficult task, but it's about decision making. For which patient would you actually offer surgery? Which are the patients who would actually respond very well to mandibular advancing devices? Which are the patients who we would like to do robotic procedures? Or which are the patients who should keep away from? You could go to Singapore General. America, Brazil especially is a melting pot of ideas. They're doing amazing job, especially in terms of skeletal work. Again, going to Stanford for observership, which is very difficult. But these are the places, because in Stanford, you can go for observership, but they ask you like your history, your mother's history, their vaccination program. It's quite difficult, but these are the places wherein you can go pretty easily as observers. Let me talk to you about the learning curve. A learning curve is steep, but it's very short. That's where you need mentors, and it's important that you go through these mentorship programs, because anybody can do a surgery, right? Operating in the mouth and in the throat and doing surgeries on the tongue and in the epiglottis is not rocket science. All of us can do it, and all of us are doing it for either cancer or something or the other. It's about decision making, how you will have to do it. I will share this example of a particular patient that we've had a couple of months ago, who presented with severe obstructive sleep apnea, a youngster who presented with severe obstructive sleep apnea, had bad epiglottic obstruction, bad tongue-base obstruction, lingual tonsil hypertrophy. So we did a midline glossectomy. We did a suprahyoid, I think we did a wedge resection of the suprahyoid epiglottis. And finally, the only good thing we luckily did was took biopsies of it because it didn't look straightforward to me. And finally, it came out that this guy had sarcoidosis. And the moment we started him on treatment with steroids, these modifying agents, started doing brilliantly well. You know, this is about it's about team effort, about decision making. It's not about surgery. Bob Sucher's is a fantastic kind of suture because you most of us see the biggest problem when we do palate surgery is the sutures giving way. So that question doesn't arise with Bob sutures because these are sutures which have bristles in it, so they get locked to the muscle. You should also have the once you take up the responsibility and situation you is like I keep saying, the decision making is what it is all about. It is about patient selection, and you need to have a team, a fantastic team of anesthetists, a fantastic team of colleagues, junior colleagues who will help you when you're faced with difficult post-op complications. A maxillofacial surgeon who's going to help you out when you do maxillofacial surgery along with sleep apnea surgery as a part of sleep apnea surgery. So it's all a team effort. So these are a few of my contributions, my journey so far. I have gone to every single, I've been invited as a invited speaker to most from 2014 onwards to all the American Academy meetings, all the European Academy meetings. Since this is a fantastic field, dear colleagues, you will, because it's a closely knit field, the potential, if you really look at the papers that have been published just in the field of obstructive sleep apnea in the last 5 years, shadow, you just go to PubMed and see how many papers have been published in the obstructive sleep apnea field. Just in the 5 years, they will overshadow any publication in any other subspecialty of ENT. This is our contribution in the sleep medicine clinics, which is an Elsevier publication. These are publications globally. So, because it's a new field, and since we are in India, you will have much more content that you can offer globally. So, scope for practice basically depends on whether you're practicing in a city, in a metro, or in a town, or in a mandal area. In a city, patients are more aware. A lot of patients come to you saying that, or their wives bring to you, or their parents bring to you. The biggest thing is about awareness. So when you have such patients, you will obviously poised in a tertiary area or in a tertiary center to deal with these patients because you get referrals. So you will have to have that backup and that kind of infrastructure. When you come to towns, what I've seen is because most of the towns are now equipped with medical colleges, and medical colleges are at par with tertiary center setups. But the problem there is you need to create the awareness because patients in towns and villages don't have that concept of obstructive sleep apnea. I mean, we get a lot of patients who are referred to our cardiology colleagues and neurology colleagues and endocrinology colleagues referred to their colleagues from towns and mandals saying that their hypertension is not under control, diabetes apnea, and voila, you have their answers and they send them to you equally and you can take care of them. in Mandal setups, you can select your cases. Every single patient of obstructive sleep apnea do not have you don't have to do a multi-level surgery. Like one of the videos that I showed you, that patient, you can just do a simple tonsillectomy and they'll be grateful to you. So the scope for practice in India is huge. This is a growing field, and dentists are waking up nowadays, especially for us in Hyderabad. I can see, and also in huge competition from, and sleep dentistry is really on the rise. It's all, like I said, it's all about cohesively working together as the sleep dental physicians, the respiratory physicians, the neurologists, the pediatricians. Pediatric sleep apnea is also growing huge. People would just do adenotonsillectomy for these patients and just leave them. But now we know that there's so much of persistence of residual obstructive sleep apnea post adenotonsillectomy that now we are dealing with. So thank you, colleagues. Thank you for spending your holiday with me. I'm guessing most of you have a holiday today. And with that slide, I'll be stopping my screen share, and I'll be happy to take any kind of questions if you'd like. Let me just stop sharing.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Hello.
So, yeah, now I've opened the chat box to all, sir, the attendees. So, we'll
Yes.
take questions.
Sure.
Request the audience to unmute and please do post your questions.
Good evening, Thomas.
Dr. Madhu.
Sir, Dr. Sudarshan Reddy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
It was very useful to the youngsters. After their PG, they can choose obstructive sleep apnea as a subspecialty. And I know you
Yes,
for the
sir.
past so many years dedicated obstructive sleep apnea awareness at the webinars, the lectures, surgical workshops. You are doing a lot for the people suffering from this disease.
Thank you,
All the
sir.
best for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
you. See, Dr. Very good to see Madhusudan sir after a long time.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Srinivas, it's really a lovely presentation, and it was very encouraging for youngsters or budding surgeons who want to choose which specialty should I go. For them, you have made a pathway that sleep apnea in India is a wonderful branch. Only thing is, you should get like training under senior surgeons like you, get polysomnography study courses. Most probably, I will join on 16th and 18th on February also. We in Nandyal, we are also doing some amount of sleep apnea surgery, but not to the level of Srinivas Kishore. Because I have learned a lot from Srinivas in many workshops and conferences. I can say I may be senior to him by age. Much to me in the knowledge in sleep apnea, so that there is nothing this thing. So I am also now motivated that why should we start much early? Really worried to do level 3 surgeries, because we live in a small place like a district headquarters or something. We are not equipped with a multi-speciality, all specialties approaches. But still, I also say that there are level 1, level 2 surgeries can be done in places like Nandyal and give wonderful results. Thank you, Srinivas. Nice to see you.
Yes, absolutely, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Nice to see you.
Good evening, Dr. Srinivas. Good evening. Hello.
Sir, Kishore sir, your voice is interrupting, sir. You lost your voice. Sir, your voice is interrupting, sir. Yeah, better now. So we have someone.
Is it okay now? Yeah.
Yes.
So I'll take these questions. I'll just probably mute my video. Maybe that way I'll reduce the bandwidth. Okay,
Yeah,
now.
so it's okay, sir. You can go ahead. There was someone who was
Okay.
just
Yes,
so request.
Yeah. Yes, I think he's back online.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead. Dr. Ranjit, please go ahead. So before they speak, sir, I have I'll read out the question.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Dr. Raj Tarak was asking, is tracheostomy necessary in every patient with OSA?
Like I was talking, it's about decision making. Tracheostomy is definitely not necessary, but you need to decide which are the patients who will need a tracheostomy based on three things. One, what are the comorbidities with which you are selecting that patient to operate? Number one. Number two, what is the infrastructure of the hospital that you are operating? Number three, are you in a situation to deal with any kind of complication? If you were to get a ghastly complication like a tongue-based bleed, or if you get, there is or there is a situation where the patient may develop a kind of what we call as REM rebound post multi-level surgery. So these complications can happen in a particular said patient. It is better to be safe and do a tracheostomy. But if you, like I showed you one patient wherein the patient had huge tonsils. That's all the patient had. So if you have a patient like that, all you have to do is some little bit of palate work and do an excellent tonsillectomy. You don't have to do a tracheostomy in such a patient. So it is all depending upon the comorbidities, the severity of the disease, and patient selection.
Yes, sir.
Did I complicate it, or is it clear?
Very clear, sir. So
Sure.
we'll move on to the next question, sir. Which is most important in SpO2 or tolerance to CPAP?
What does that mean?
Yeah,
I didn't understand the question.
Question is incomplete.
Yeah, so good. Important in SpO2. SpO2 means I didn't understand.
Yeah, probably
Tolerance.
Narayana sir can just repeat the question if it is online.
Yes.
So next question about pillar implants.
Yes. So I'm confident that this is somebody who is out of India, because pillar implants, we don't have them in India anymore. 2014-15, Medtronic took it out, but the place for pillar implant is only in habitual snoring and in mild obstructive sleep apnea. But again, there are big problems with it because one, this is not a long-term solution. The patients would definitely come back to you. And if you are in a third world, it obviously costs a lot of money. With the same, if you have same disease profile for which you have to, if you want to put a pillar implant for the patient, you might as well do what is called as an injection snoroplasty, or you can use radiofrequency or coblation and get the same kind of result. The next question is, which is better, DISE or dynamic MR? I would say this is a debate that's been going on for years. Both of them, they actually complement each other. DISE is an endoluminal kind of exam. All right. There are advantages and disadvantages for both. Let me just quickly highlight each one of them. DISE is a drug-induced study. So I'm going to talk about the disadvantages first. DISE is a drug-induced study wherein you are subjecting the patient to a drug. But said that, there is a lot of literature that says that whether you use propofol or whether you use midazolam, the stage of sleep that you would take that particular patient to when subjecting the patient to drug-induced sleep endoscopy is N2 sleep. Now, N2 sleep is the sleep that most adults go through. So what they did in a fantastic paper was that they gave propofol this patient, and next day they did a non-propofol sleep study for this patient, and they measured and they found out that the AHI was same. Nowadays, what we do is level perform drug-induced sleep endoscopy, and we call this advanced DISE. However, having said that, there are some issues with when you have a skeletal patient, and when you have a patient who is a mouth breather, when you have a patient with a very small maxilla or a small mandible, your drug-induced sleep endoscopy may not be able to give you the information that a dynamic MR gives you. But the biggest problem with dynamic MR is subjecting the patient through a dynamic MR during natural sleep. What lot of people are doing nowadays is they're drugging them, they are giving them alprazolam and putting them through dynamic MR machines and doing the drug-induced sleep endoscopy. Now, that is very dangerous, number one. And number two, if these patients would develop tongue-based obstruction because of alprazolam, which is a benzodiazepine, you will be in a very sticky situation, because if the patient desaturates in an MRI gantry, it's going to be very difficult for us to explain to the patient and the attender what went wrong. Then the next question, in a patient with multi-level obstruction with severe OSA, do you suggest to do all necessary soft tissue surgeries? No, Nadia. So now we are very clear in our protocol or in our algorithms when we discuss. So even before we subject the patient to a multi-level surgery, we differentiate. So that's why I was talking to you about evaluation. So you have to, first of all, differentiate whether this patient is a soft tissue patient, or is this patient a skeletal patient, or is this a combined patient? And once you decide, only then you will subject the patient to the necessary surgical protocols. So you are not justified anymore to waste time for a skeletal patient to put him through all the soft tissue surgeries and then offer him a skeletal procedure. No, we don't do that anymore. We even at that point of evaluation itself, we differentiate them, whether they fit into the soft tissue basket or the skeleton basket. Or can we do maxillomandibular advancement straight away? Yes, you can. But you cannot do a maxillary advancement for a epiglottic collapse, can you? You will not do a maxillomandibular advancement for a grade 4 tonsil. You will not do a maxillomandibular advancement for a grade 4 lingual tonsil, will you? So it is about evaluation. However, if you would have seen the second video that I showed you to a patient with retrognathia with decreased volume of maxilla, yes, for that particular patient, you won't offer a modified expansion sphincter pharyngoplasty. So it is all about decision making and selecting the right procedure for the right patient.
Next question is, what are the medications you suggest during sleep endoscopy in pediatric versus adult?
Yeah. So Nadia, pediatric drug-induced sleep endoscopy is something which is gaining a lot of momentum, especially in patients post-adenotonsillectomy with residual OSA, patients who are syndromic, Down's children, and all these kids we now do drug-induced sleep endoscopy for. Even before we do, there's an entire repertoire that I can go through with you, that who are the patients that will benefit from a drug-induced sleep endoscopy. Before you even do a surgical intervention, you have to do DICE. Now, the medications are, number one, you need to induce them with ketamine, number one. Number two, you need to, once you induce them, because the patient will not walk into your operation theater like how the adults do. So you give them ketamine, you take them to your drug-induced sleep endoscopy suite. Then you give them, you can gas them with sevoflurane. Then we give dexmedetomidine. These three are the drugs that we normally use. Prosthesis to fix tongue or nasal, yes. Definitely, you can use mandibular advancing devices. You can use tongue retaining devices. You can use nasal LR dilators, which are all conservative methods to deal with them. But you need to first of all say whether this patient has an intranasal valve collapse or no. Just giving him a prosthesis to the tongue, if his obstruction at the level of the epiglottis or in the oropharynx, won't help. I hope that answers your question, Mohammed.
Yes, sir. So I request the postgraduates and young junior consultants who are freshly passed out. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and interact with sir.
Okay, I think if there anything else, I'll be happy to answer. I'm not stopping anybody, right, Harsha? I'm not. I've not crossed my limit, isn't it? Of course, I did, but no. I'm not stopping anybody, right?
No.
There's nothing after this, right?
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you. So,
one question.
Manjit, how are you?
Fine, yes. I just get straight to the point. So the question is, you did mention some time about doing a Kashima in a patient with obstructive sleep apnea. Is that right?
Yes.
So what kind of what was the indication, or can you elaborate on that? Because do you do it on a routine basis once in a while?
No, not really. This patient I was referring to you is actually an adolescent patient who's about 15-16 years of age, for whom actually he had snoring, and he was taken to a physician who did a sleep study. Unfortunately, the physician didn't even hear to the patient's snore. But even if any ENT surgeon would hear to that particular sound that patient was making, you would know that it's a stridor and not a snore. Subsequently, the patient was referred to an ENT surgeon who saw grade 4 tonsils for this particular patient and did an adenotonsillectomy. Subsequently, the patient did not improve, and the whole palsy, which had cords in the paramedian position or in cadaver position. So he was not very breathy, or he was a little bit breathy, but the moment he went into sleep, because of certain phases of sleep. So there is a condition called it is for laryngomalacia, but it is called occult laryngomalacia, wherein the epiglottis falls. But in this patient's snoring started getting worse only during sleep. When he's awake, he's fine. He does not complain of any shortness of breath. Anyway, so finally we did a sleep endoscopy to find out what was wrong with this patient. And to my surprise, it was the cords which were the problem. We did a Kashima for this patient, and he was all right.
So that's an extreme situation. It's a one of a kind, it's out of the way.
Yes, yes.
And what's your message to people who, especially I think there are PGs in the forum here. So what is your message to people who don't have access to a Coblator?
So it's like, I'm somebody who says that it is not about the tool. It's all about the fool behind the tool. I get calls from, you would be surprised, saying that, sir, we've purchased a Coblator. When do I start sleep surgery? It's not about purchasing a machine. It's not about your ability to do awesome procedure. It's all about your ability to execute and select the procedure that you are supposed to do. So what I would basically suggest is you can do it very beautifully, even with cold steel. You can, even though I would strongly suggest that if you have a Coblator, nothing like it, but you can use beautiful needles that you get from radiofrequency devices, either Elmin or Sutter. They also come with very nice laryngeal needles that you can use. You can use a laser if you're trained to do it. But to me and in my hands, Coblator is the best. But that doesn't mean you have to use only a Coblator to do it.
Sure. Thank you very much. One more last question.
Yeah. Sure.
See, sometimes we come across patients, especially when we interview patients after the sleep study. Generally, you ask the patient, how was your experience, or how was the the study experience? Come across patients who say they were not really comfortable in the place. To that input when you look at the sleep study, PSG.
So nowadays, and hence because of COVID, now everything has become home-based, and even the AASM, which is the World Sleep Society and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, does endorse sleep studies at home. So, and now ResMed has a beautiful device. It's called One Sleep Study, which costs about 4,000 rupees. And it's a very small device that you can put it on your finger, and it gives you an average of 3 nights sleep study. And it's US FDA approved, and it gives you all the data, all the cardiorespiratory data, and it's as good as the data as you can get from a level 3 sleep study. So home sleep studies are here to stay, unless you have a patient who's on multiple drugs for depression, comorbidities. Obstructive sleep apnea is unfortunately a disease wherein there are huge overlaps with depression, with insomnia, for whom they are with a bunch of drugs. So if you have somebody like that, it's better, or somebody who's a patient with seizure disorder, or somebody who has parasomnias, he has sleep disorders like, REM-related sleep disorders, and, he's not a classical clear-cut obstructive sleep apnea patient. He has an overlap condition with another sleep disorder, then you better do a level 1 sleep study.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ranjit. Thank you for being there. Thank you very much, Ranjit. Thank you for being there. Thank you for the questions.
Sir, when do you suggest to repeat sleep study after the
Yes.
study?
So usually you need to repeat the sleep study after 6 months, 3 to 6 months. And why? Because you need to measure there has to be some kind of an outcome measure, isn't it, Nadia? And at this point, the universally accepted outcome measure is the sleep study. So universally, you need to do that. But I, for one, not only do, and I would also urge all of you, not only to do only the sleep study as an outcome measure, but also do some kind of a patient related outcome measure. We call them patient-specific quality outcome measures, PSQIs. Either you can do SF36, you can do any of these quality of life questionnaires, which actually gives a very subjective perspective to the objective outcome that comes out of your sleep study. So it's important that you need to measure your outcomes, isn't it? If you keep on doing the surgeries and the patient says that I am fine or I'm not fine, you need to have some kind of an outcome measure.
Yes, sir. I suppose that answers your question. We have Dr. Vidyasagar sir is also joined in.
Okay, good to see him.
I request him to make few comments about the careers and his version and his experience.
Sure.
If he's willing.
Sure, of course. Sagar, please take over, man.
Hey, no, man. Good evening. Hello.
Good evening, Sagar.
Good evening, everyone. It's a fantastic talk. Sorry that I joined only a little late, but I think you addressed most part very nicely. So I think there is nothing much for me to add or anything, It is fabulous. Fabulous talk as usual.
Happy Pongal, by the way, Sagar.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Same to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sri Harsha. Thank you for doing this. Many are getting the right message through this portal. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So I think we have come to the end of the Q&A session, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you once again, sir. We had a lot of insights and educational content from today's session. So we'll be probably doing a monthly once in this speakers and all. Updating about the next webinar in this. It's likely to be about career plans. Thank you once again, sir. Wish you all.
Thank you.
Depending on which parts of India, wherever you are. Thank you once again and have a good night. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Harsha. Fantastic job. Really applaud you on this. Bye-bye. Thank you.